Spider-Man Brand New Day is finally here, and Spider-Man fans, I genuinely don't remember the last time I've seen them this happy. As for me, though I am not as fully head over heels for Brand New Day as I wanted to be, I cannot pretend this thing isn't a huge step in a direction I've really wanted to see, and with how it balances so many disparate characters, ideas, and plot threads, this thing is a total miracle. But I think most importantly is that it really brings some outstanding themes to the table and fully delivers on its messaging about our inherent need for support and community. I've got a lot to say about this movie, so let's get into Spider-Man Brand New Day. Okay, I guess before we get into the nitty-gritty of Brand New Day, we should talk about what I really wanted to see out of this movie going in, because as I like to occasionally remind my audience, I really love Spider-Man, and there have been things I've loved about all three live-action movie iterations of the character, despite having misgivings in some areas. I personally never disliked the Holland Spidey films. I thought they did a solid job interweaving him with the existing MCU and differentiating themselves from their Spidey film predecessors without losing sight of the character. Was it my preferred version or setting for Peter Parker? Nah, but I really appreciated what they did. But even with my generally positive feelings about that trilogy, it was impossible not to be excited about the possibilities of post No Way Home Peter Parker, stripping him of the resources he had from the Avengers / Stark connections, not just tragically losing May, but his best friends and girlfriend, now having to navigate his hero life without those friends, family, or any of his hero relationships, without any sense of community, bringing him fully back to basics and maybe propelling him back into that simple, friendly neighborhood territory. And when it comes to Brand New Day, I would say they mostly deliver on the promise of that premise. Mostly. And they basically dive right into it, giving us an outstanding montage showcasing what Peter has done solo over the course of 4 years, measured alongside him following Ned and MJ's time at college via social media. It's both wildly satisfying to see Spider-Man tackling all these street-level threats, and incredibly sad to see him missing out on any kind of social life as he further isolates and misses his friends. They basically just launch into this film showcasing that age-old Spider-Man formula: when Spider-Man wins, Peter Parker loses. In this opening, many sort of lower-tier Spidey villains make brief appearances, and it sort of delivers the New York City I've always wanted to see a Spider-Man exist in on film. One where Scorpion might be robbing a bank in Midtown while Boomerang is wreaking havoc on the Upper East Side. It's the kind of thing that makes me believe that even though we haven't met him and don't see him, someone like Otto Octavius is probably tinkering away in a lab somewhere. Honestly, my only real problem was that it was such a brief part of the movie. I was so happy to see Tombstone going toe-to-toe with Spidey, but damn, do I really want to see that guy in the midst of like a gang turf war? This is all the kind of stuff that the Insomniac video games actually deliver so well. It makes you feel like there isn't just one isolated threat happening in New York City at a time, which before this is what all the movies sort of felt like. New threat rises, Spidey takes them down, end of story, repeat. The fact that they brought back Michael Mando as Scorpion after his last appearance was in Homecoming really lent to this feeling like these guys are constantly being put away and breaking out again. It was really satisfying, and they didn't need to handhold us through how Scorpion got his giant mechanical scorpion tail. We know the deal. Spider-Man stops Spider-Man villains. Truly, this is the MCU's Spider-Man at his absolute most successful in terms of crime fighting. Not only has he managed to take down all of these criminals, but the public absolutely adores him, to a degree that we've not really seen since like Spider-Man 3 or maybe Into the Spider-Verse. But as Spidey's popularity rises, we see Peter isolate further and further, cementing this film in that when Spider-Man wins, Peter Parker loses mentality. This is also absolutely the most New York focused any of these MCU Spider-Man films have felt. Homecoming was a little bit more Queens-centric, which I do think worked great for that story. Far From Home was obviously in Europe, and No Way Home had just so much going on with that multiversal narrative that New York itself is a bit of an afterthought. But Brand New Day, you just immediately feel the presence of the city, largely highlighted by what are easily the best swinging sequences in any of Tom Holland's Spider-Man movies. This is also just a personal thing, but this is the first of these movies to release since I moved to New York City, and it was so cool to see the New York skyline that I recognize showcased so thoroughly on screen. That skyline has changed a lot since Raimi's first Spider-Man film, film, and even since the Amazing duology, so it was really cool to see Spider-Man jumping off of the skyscrapers that I can see from my window. But as it stands, this opening basically put me in Spidey ecstasy. It was the exact thing I wanted to see out of Peter Parker at this point in his story. But I liked it so much that it sort of made me wish that this had been the movie. We basically jumped past these 4 vitally impactful years of Peter's life as Spider-Man. I sort of wanted to see a story about these things that we got in the montage. Peter taking down these criminals, investigating Tombstone's operations, forming his relationship with Detective DeWolf. Ultimately, this is just me wanting more Spider-Man, and it doesn't really matter in the scheme of this analysis because I really loved a lot of what Brand New Day did. It just almost feels like it could have been a little more impactful if it came one movie later. And it still all has me optimistic that we'll just see more of this stuff as we hopefully round out this second MCU trilogy. The first act of this movie does a pretty great job giving us that sort of street level investigation stuff that I wanted to see. They clearly took a lot of cues from the Insomniac games. They introduced Detective DeWolf, who works closely with Spidey as a sort of liaison, but I particularly liked that she was also kind of trying to step in as almost like a surrogate mother figure in May's absence, albeit more from a mentor point of view. She is like immediately telling him he's got to take better care of himself, avoid losing himself in the job, and this was pointedly to show that at this point, like 90% of his life is Spider-Man, and the other 10% is just when he goes to visit May's grave. The only time he's Peter Parker is when he's grieving. And so everything they set up in this first act is Spidey forward, and quickly he has to try to take down this rampaging tank that eventually crashes into a damage control facility. This is also where they introduce Punisher into the mix. Obviously, Punisher is like a pretty hardcore vigilante, and Spidey, by comparison, is a bit of a goody two-shoes to say the least, which establishes what I found to be a really fun and interesting dynamic. It's like Spidey has to not only worry about whatever threat is at hand, but also expend energy trying to make sure Frank's brand of justice doesn't cause more chaos. The whole tank damage control debacle also soft introduces the primary antagonist of the film, somebody who can basically body hop between people at closer range and take over their bodies and actions. Look, I'm sure you've seen the movie. We all know who it is. I'll talk about her a lot more later in the video. She's going to get a whole dedicated section. We also see that this person can't possess Peter, which makes him the only real person for the investigation. Okay, this is becoming a tiny bit less street level with that power set, but it's still operating on street level. It's definitely a really intriguing mystery, and I like that a lot of the rest of this act is just Spider-Man investigating. I found it so wildly entertaining to just see Spidey going place to place, interviewing people to try and gather evidence, whether that's Yelena in Brighton Beach or Metzger at the damage control building. Seeing Spidey just sit in an office chair and ask questions, that is the good stuff. There were 2 really big things that I was pretty worried about going into this movie, and the first was the MCU bloat. I felt like on paper, the characters included in this film would make for a really overstuffed narrative. Plus, I sort of questioned the choices in MCU characters here. People have been begging for a Daredevil Spidey team up forever, and instead we're getting Punisher, Hulk, and new Black Widow. But I am really happy to say that for those characters, they felt incredibly well woven into the narrative, far more organically than I anticipated. I was initially kind of bummed that the big street level character they opted for was Punisher and not Daredevil, but ultimately, not only did Punisher have that really entertaining dynamic with Peter, but he was also a perfect counterpart to aid in those themes of self-isolation and need for community that the story so thoroughly explores. Though something tragic happened to Peter and the spell made his friends forget him, he is still choosing to be alone, deciding that it's better for Ned and MJ that he stay out of their lives. But Frank is a character who lost his loved ones, but not by choice. He's a perfect mirror for Peter to look into in that specific journey, and it's just really encouraging that the creatives here didn't choose the popular fan choice, they chose the one that made sense for the story and its themes. Yelena could have felt like a meaningless cameo, but they established she has this rapport with Spidey and can help him with some of those higher level research clearances thanks to her new Avengers role. I like seeing the different dynamics varying like tier levels of heroes have with one another. I also love that he travels all the way down to Brighton Beach to meet with her, which is a primarily Russian neighborhood in Brooklyn. This movie, even in those little details, seems to really want to use the New York setting in an effective way. Bruce Banner / Hulk was the big concern I had when they said this was going to be a street level Spider-Man story, but they have him teaching at ESU, and he is of course the perfect character for Peter to try and connect with when he struggles with the big spider mutation development. And I mean, yeah, typically that role might be reserved for someone like, say, Doc Doc Connors, but at least if we're going to use MCU characters, we're using them naturally and not just as cameo fodder. Okay, speaking of the mutation, the catalyst for that has to do with the second thing that I was super worried about going into this film, and that is the reintroduction of MJ and Ned just one movie after they forgot who Peter was. That felt like a reintroduction that could have been more impactful down the road, and I am ecstatic to say that the MJ and Ned side of this movie are 100% the highlight of the entire film. Something that shocked me because while I like them as characters just fine, they were never my favorite parts of the previous MCU Spidey films, but they just handled the storyline with such shocking restraint and it really impressed me. I love that Peter keeps his distance until he just happens upon Ned at a bodega and decides to follow him to the party that he's clearly going to. It makes sense to me that Peter would have the willpower to keep his distance intentionally, but that when confronted with his best friends up close, that need for human connection is too strong. People can only go so long without other people. That's something that this movie really understands. Okay, but what doesn't make sense is that Ned goes to a bodega in one neighborhood, buys 2 mini kegs, takes them with him on the subway to his own neighborhood, and brings them to his own party. Why wouldn't he just buy beer at his own bodega? This is simply the least believable thing in a film about spider-human mutant hybrids and telepaths. But I love the way that Peter's pining for connection with Ned and MJ is such a major catalyst in the story. Seeing MJ kiss her new boyfriend triggers the crazy spider mutations through basically full-on trauma. Our quote-unquote mysterious red-headed telepath learning about this pining for MJ gives her the leverage she needs to get Peter to back off. Okay, you know what? I'm just gonna stop that. We all know it's Jean Grey. I'm just gonna start calling her Jean Grey. But I cannot say enough about how impressed I was by the way they handled the MJ stuff. This is for sure Zendaya's best performance in any of these movies, and I think that is largely because they actually give her character real substantial material to work with. For one, even if it wasn't a surprising reveal, I love that the movie gave us this like fairy tale reconnection scene where MJ figures it all out, where the true love's kiss brings MJ back to Peter, only to reveal that it was of course Jean possessing MJ to manipulate Peter. But then later in the film, we get the actual scene where MJ does find out after she discovers Peter's letter, and they give us the real world way this would play out. A scene that actually grapples with the realities of this scenario and gives MJ's character autonomy and pathos. Can you imagine learning something like this? That an entire meaningful relationship from a huge part of your life has just been erased from your memory? Standing in front of that person, trying to remember them as their heart breaks? Zendaya delivers these lines about not having those memories in such a heartbreaking fashion, but almost like her heart is breaking for Peter. I'm so glad that they had her flat out say, "I don't love you," because of course she doesn't. She doesn't know him. It is, to me, one of the absolute highlights of the film, and I'm so glad that they didn't just undo the spell or yada yada over this harsh, heartbreaking aspect of the scenario. But the absolute best scene in the movie comes right after this, after Peter takes MJ home and she asks if he wants to come up to say hi to Ned. Truly, I don't think I had any happier moment in this movie as a fan of Spidey than seeing him sit in that beanbag chair and build Legos with Ned and MJ. His first time socializing and spending meaningful time with anyone in 4 years. It is simultaneously just a wildly charming scene, and also it kind of distills the film down to its most important themes. And I love that he also just starts to build a new rapport with MJ. This film doesn't bring them back together romantically, but they still have chemistry, and you can see that even just being around her is good for him. This is illustrated kind of subtly earlier in the film when his spider DNA was going out of whack and he couldn't control his powers very well. The one time that he could keep them under control without any issue was while he was holding MJ, swinging her to safety, which I think makes this a good time to talk about the whole mutation aspect and how that ties to its themes. This film is all about how Peter has not just isolated himself from the rest of the world, but how he has pointedly propelled Spider-Man out into the world. I talked about this earlier, but like 90% of his life is Spider-Man and only 10% is Peter tops. And so the obvious idea here behind Peter's spider DNA continuing to evolve is that it parallels that ratio of Spidey-Peter balance. The idea that as Peter loses his life to Spider-Man, the DNA sort of metaphorically follows that balance, amping up the spider and downplaying the man. And I do think this is a relatively cool idea. You know, it definitely harkens back to Raimi's Spider-Man 2, the way we see emotional turmoil manifest in Peter and mess with his abilities. In that one, basically hampering his abilities as he reckons with the grief of seeing Mary Jane start her life with another man. In that one, his body and mind were sort of forcing him into a place where he would feel okay leaving behind Spidey and pursuing his love. This one sort of takes that same exact setup but flips the results. Rather than Peter's abilities being taken out of the equation, they actually ramp up. Here, his body's way of coping is not to feel regret and lead him to unmake the decision he's already made, but instead to double down and dive fully into Spider-Man. Peter Parker is the one with those feelings. Peter Parker is the one who is heartbroken, so it just sort of takes Peter Parker out of the equation. And Peter's use of an inhibitor to try and quell this mutation was also a pretty interesting metaphor. Peter is having these wildly intense emotions that need to be expressed, and since he wasn't expressing them himself, his body did it for him. But because those emotions were making it harder for Peter to operate as Spider-Man, he opts to literally suppress the manifestation of that emotional expression. You know, it's like when I bury myself in my work and make 8 videos in a month instead of dealing with my emotional turmoil. Yeah, it's gonna work as a distraction for a bit, but those suppressed emotions will fester and bubble to the surface until they express themselves in a way that I don't intend them to. And I really liked that in this movie, that came in the form of Pete becoming far too aggressive in a fight with Scorpion, nearly killing somebody in the process. I think this all really lends itself to the idea that Peter truly can't keep isolating like this, because in doing so, he starts to lose himself. And he is the one holding tight to that great power, great responsibility mantra. Without Peter, the great responsibility slides. All right, now is as good a time as any to explore the Jean Grey of it all. And I have to say, I am not sure it was a smart move to have Sadie Sink do weeks of press for this film without being able to even hint at who her character is. It's kind of insane. And the movie doesn't even really treat it like a reveal. I guess it's kind of a reveal for the audience, but halfway through the movie, they just learn what her name is. And while I might have some misgivings about her being the villain, which I'll talk about later, I can't pretend like Jean's abilities don't make a perfect foil for Peter's current life circumstances. A guy who is intensely private, harboring secrets about his previous life, secrets he's harboring strictly to keep the people he loves safe. And he is faced with an antagonist who can easily infiltrate Peter's well-guarded and isolated life and use the subjects of those repressed anxieties against him. And I thought that she was herself a very compelling character, pitting Peter against somebody who is also experiencing grief due to the loss of a loved one, but is also fully letting that grief control their actions. Generally, these films work best when the villains somehow reflect the inner turmoil that Peter is experiencing, and I can't pretend like that doesn't work here, even if Jean Grey isn't who I would have chosen as a Spidey villain heading into the second MCU trilogy. And it all has a lot to do with how they bring everything together in the third act. But before we get to that, let me maybe take a bit of time to talk about the things that didn't fully work for me. Because while this film did have a solid handle on its themes and characters, I also felt like some of its decisions were only like a half step towards what was promised. I think a lot of people really took issue with the way MCU Peter was previously so teched up thanks to the Stark and Avengers connections. Iron Man Jr., the fanboys whisper as they cry into their pillows. And the end of No Way Home did really seem to promise the idea of a completely stripped down Peter operating with much more of a basic DIY setup. Hell, he had a sewing machine that he made his new suit with. And though this film did keep him somewhat in that space, it feels like they maybe walked it back a little. For one, how the hell is Peter paying rent? Why isn't that part of the story? Is he just living on an inheritance from May? And though it obviously isn't tech on the same level as the Stark gear, Peter has a lot of tech going on in this apartment. I know Civil War established that he dumpster dives, but like, dude has a 3D printer. Those aren't cheap, and I have a hard time believing he found one of those in a dumpster. I do like that as a tech setup, it does feel more makeshift and DIY, but it still feels like they were a bit afraid to strip Peter's setup entirely and tried to find a middle ground, which brings me to Evie, the AI Peter uses throughout the film. This, I think, bothered me the most because it really did not feel all that far off from what we saw with his homecoming suit or with Edith in Far From Home. It's just all shades of Jarvis. And to me, it felt like Evie's primary role was to help deliver specific kinds of exposition/lore. Like, did we really need her to calculate the whole 33 feet thing for Jean's mind-jumping powers? We don't think Peter could have just noticed that there was a limit to the range and ballparked it? He's a smart guy. Or in how she just straight up explains the whole mutation ratio issue, or tells Peter that the inhibitor is overheating. This is all stuff that feels like Peter should be figuring out himself, and that the movie could just be telling us through visual storytelling cues. To me, if you really want to use this kind of an AI device, the missed opportunity here was to use Evie to help further explore the themes and how Peter actually needs a community around him. Imagine if we had a moment where after seeing MJ kiss her boyfriend and falling into that depression, Peter tries to talk to Evie like a confidant or friend, and instead of getting any feedback feedback of substance or nuance, he gets empty responses that don't help at all, further hammering home on the idea that self-isolating from people is not sustainable. And though I do quite like how a lot of this movie played out as presented, there is just one major thing that's kind of hard for me to get over, and that is that the villain is not a Spider-Man villain. Now look, I do think they did a much better job weaving Jean's story into Peter's than I expected they might, despite the origin flashback feeling like a detour, and I am pretty happy with how everything came together in the end. Jean is an interesting character, and they used her abilities in an organic way that could particularly mess with Peter at this point in his life. The story as presented is strong, but at the same time, after a whole trilogy where fans kind of complained that it felt like Peter's stories were being hijacked by other MCU characters, and that we just want to let it be a Spider-Man movie, I'm surprised that so many are kind of looking past this major aspect of this movie. I think the one part of the movie that really feels like it has the wind taken out of its sails is when we get that origin flashback for Jean. Suddenly we're in a different movie. Spider-Man Brand New Day, X-Men Origins, Jean Grey. And while, again, I mostly liked how she pieced into the narrative, particularly by the end, which we'll talk about shortly, it's hard to look at them using the villain slot to set up another MCU franchise and not be a little disappointed. I mean, yeah, you could argue that Bill Metzger at Damage Control is the real villain, but A, that's sort of semantics. The story was driven by Jean as the villain, and B, Metzger was first introduced as an X-Men character anyways. I think moving into the rest of this trilogy, I hope that they just stop being so afraid to bring in new versions of the villains that we saw from the Raimi and Webb movies. Obviously, there's a slight narrative hitch because Peter knows those characters thanks to No Way Home, but I just don't think there's any reason that the MCU should not have an Otto Octavius or Norman Osborn, and I'm hopeful that some of those other villains we saw in the opening, namely Scorpion and Tombstone, will get more time to shine in future installments as well. It would be a huge shame to cast and introduce Tombstone just for a montage. And I do think for everything that I love about this film, sometimes it can feel like it's pulling from other Spidey media a little too blatantly. Obviously, we mentioned the Spidey 2 parallels with emotional turmoil affecting abilities, but also that relationship with Detective DeWolf, and a lot of the action feels pulled directly from the Insomniac video games. The whole vigil sequence at the end is incredibly reminiscent of a similar sequence in Spider-Verse, and while none of these things really dinged me in isolation, there is something to be said about the cumulative nature of them. That being said, despite them feeling like they were out of other projects, these were actually all such major highlights of the film that it doesn't really matter. I mean, we haven't even really talked about how much of a step up this action is compared to the other MCU entries, and that is in large part because they decided to lift so much from those video games. These action set pieces all just feel so well choreographed and intentional. It never felt like the action was an afterthought here or something that was left up to the VFX team to work out after the fact. They clearly went into this film with a plan. It really feels like everybody on this thing was incredibly locked in and feared disappointing the fans, since they really shored up so many of the things that tended to be highest on the complaint list about the previous trilogy. And it seems like a lot of this started with Tom Holland, who used his leverage as the star to make sure they didn't rush the process and produced something that everyone could be proud of. And speaking of Holland, wow, this is without a doubt his best performance as Peter Parker to date, and I don't think it's even particularly close. He really deftly balances the heartbreak and the quips, but I also just love that it seems like he's putting on a bit more of like a New York accent this time around. Some of my favorite performance moments are just from some of his goofier deliveries in that investigative phase. When he stops before leaving Metzger's office to ask him about VMAX, I swear he momentarily feels like Columbo in both delivery and mannerisms, and I say that in an extremely complimentary way. There is a scene where he's sitting behind this curtain working on his inhibitor where MJ is sitting on the other side and they're talking about their lives and hints at his lost relationship, and I honestly started seeing shades of Garfield's Peter Parker in his soft and awkward earnestness. Again, this is extremely complimentary. Okay, let's get into the climax, which obviously ends up being pretty Jean Grey centric, but honestly I was really impressed with how adeptly they balanced these characters, the themes, and the lingering plot threads at the end of this thing. When Peter realizes Metzger was lying and that he's thrown Jean to the wolves, he immediately jumps to correct that mistake, and as Jean learns that VMAX was nothing more than the final thing that her sister ever saw before she was murdered, she completely gives herself over to her abilities. Obviously a clean parallel with Peter's journey here as he tries to regulate how much he gives himself over to his powers. And the parallel is really important because as Jean uses her powers in pain and grief, we see how that affects everybody around her, putting a huge chunk of New York in this hostage stasis as she pursues revenge. But as he tries desperately to get to Jean, Peter does eventually relent and embraces those mutations that have been overtaking him, but he refuses to give himself over to those mutations. He also embraces his identity as Peter Parker. He is both Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and this fight scene is pointedly delivered with his mask off, showing him embrace his identity as Peter Parker through these spider abilities. And this allows Peter to be the one to try and really get through to Jean. While I did complain a bit about how the Jean flashback takes the wind out of the sails of the film, it did at least establish this idea that Jean is harboring resentment towards her mother for abandoning her and her sister when they developed their powers. And I have to admit that the way they wove this into the climax did really work for me. Peter finally lets Jean into his mind, finally lets somebody in, and we get a flashback to May right after she found out that Peter is Spider-Man. For one, it's a great way to bring Marissa Tomei back, showcase a moment that lots of fans wanted to see in this universe, but then they tie that motherly pep talk from May into Jean's need for that kind of unconditional love and support from a parental figure. To me, it just really worked. And in tandem with this, Peter hears the words that he needed to as well. The memory of May that he was seemingly repressing. The reminder that this is not a burden to shoulder all alone. That by isolating, he was actually not honoring May's memory. Just because we've lost someone doesn't mean we have to do this alone. This all comes right before Frank tries to shoot Jean to stop her telekinetic hostage scenario, and Peter pushes her aside, taking the bullet himself. This is pretty hardcore, and look, a lot of this climactic sequence maybe feels a little stuffed with all of these different elements, but ultimately, I think they brought it home through the themes. Jean inhabits Peter's mind, and somehow, with her various telekinetic abilities, keeps him alive just long enough to be treated. Frank rushes him to the hospital and sits by his side until he wakes up, and we see that even in his isolated period of his life, it turns out that the connections he was unwittingly making along the way to Jean, to Frank, are the things that kept him alive. Okay, I know Frank is also the one who accidentally shot him, but you know what I mean. If Peter had not reached Jean as a friend on a personal level and rejected that isolating, guarded attitude that he was embracing the entire movie, she wouldn't have saved his life. And as Peter walks out of the hospital and the crowd starts cheering for Spider-Man, he gets to see and feel that love and support that comes from community, a community he was unknowingly bringing together. All of these final beats, the community rallying, that newfound connection with Frank, Jean's part in saving his life, they all point to the obvious realization he needed to come to. The pep talk from May that he was seemingly repressing. He cannot do this alone. He would not be here anymore if he were doing it alone. Our friends, our relationships, our community, they are the thing that keeps us living. And I love that he reaffirms this at May's grave. He is not going to do this alone anymore. And there are so many little details at the end of this that so beautifully showcase how he's moved forward with this in mind. There's this great shot of Peter on a skyscraper sitting next to a cup, the cup that looks just like the one he was holding on to from MJ with the letter he wrote to her inside. But instead, he picks it up and casually takes a sip. It is no longer an empty cup. His cup is full. I love the way that this also helps reframe and bolster his commitment to great responsibility, because ultimately, we also have a responsibility to ourselves and to our own well-being. At the beginning of the movie, we saw Peter keep Detective DeWolf at arm's length, despite the advice she was trying to give him, but this time, he not only takes her advice to sit back and take care of himself, but he tells her to say hi to her kids, EJ and Marley. At the beginning of the movie, he did not know their names, illustrating that he is starting to embrace this community he is building. And of course, this really great final beat. As Peter goes to grab flowers for May, he sees Ned eating at the bodega. He takes a step away, then glances down at the flowers, remembering that promise to not do it alone, before he walks back up to Ned, says hi, and their secret handshake seemingly dislodges all of Ned's lost memories. I love that this final beat is just a reaffirmation of that need for community. I just think this film really pulled it all together when it mattered most. And honestly, I think it has a message that a lot of people probably really need to hear. If you are hurting, if you are grieving, if you are suffering, if you have lost somebody, you do not have to go through it alone. Just because we've lost someone doesn't mean we need to go through it alone.
Johnny Two Cellos. I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.